so many ways in this life that we can be disappointed. Things don't work out the way you planned them. People don't respond the way you'd hoped they would. Unwelcome events come into our lives that don't seem to make any sense at all. And then there's other things. There's prayers that go unanswered. There's dreams that are unfulfilled, and there's visions that die. It is part of our life here in this fallen world, disappointment. Now, if you look disappointment in the dictionary, you'll find 5 words. And the first 3 words you will find are hopes, desires, and expectations. And then the 2 words that will follow them will be frustrated and thwarted. Hopes, desires, and expectations that are frustrated and thwarted. Now, all of mankind deals with disappointment. In our secular world, I suppose the atheist can rail at the universe when disappointment comes into his or her life. The agnostic, I would think, could continue to feed his doubts, disappointment being one more reason to doubt the existence of God. The theist or the deist, I suppose he could take cold comfort reminding himself that God is distant and impersonal, set this world in place, and then walked away. I think the nominal Christian, I've seen this, where in their disappointment, they can attempt to remake God in their own image, unfettered by the truth of Scripture. But for the believer, we don't have any such escapes. Not to say any of those are very effective, because they're not. But for us, we have to deal with the God who is, the God who cannot be explained away, the God who created us individually and uniquely, the God that saved us individually and uniquely at infinite cost to himself. He's also the God who promises us an abundant life here on earth. And he promises us a breathtaking eternity with him forever. This is the God we know. And this is the God that we must deal with in the midst of our disappointments. There's a spouse that dies and was not healed. There's the loved one whose health continues to deteriorate and never gets better, and you get to watch them suffer. There's the husband, the wife, the child, the sibling, the parent, or the boss that just continues to break your heart over and over again. They're just wearing you out. There's the finances that never get better. There's the opportunities that never come. There's the failures that haunt you in middle age, keep coming back to haunt you. There's the loneliness and the isolation of the aged and the infirm. And then there's the mental, emotional struggles that maybe your whole life you've tried to deal with and tried to shake, and you can't quite get free. To make it more complicated, disappointment is dispensed unevenly by circumstances and by temperament. And that adds to the problem, because depending on which side of the equation you're on, that introduces the idea of jealousy and envy on one hand, because someone else does not encounter the same disappointments that you have, or pride and judgment on the other hand, because you can't figure out why people can't just get their act together. He was one of the richest, wealthiest men on earth, and God proclaimed him a righteous man, one of the most righteous men that ever walked the earth at that time. He was in the ancient world, probably a contemporary of Abraham. And he came under satanic attack, and he lost everything. He lost his children, he lost his health, he lost all his wealth, and then he lost his reputation. And this is what disappointment looked like to Job in his own words. He says, "My days are past, my plans are torn apart, even the wishes of my heart. Where is now my hope, and who regards my hope? Even today my complaint is rebellion. His hand is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. When he acts on the left, I cannot behold him. He turns on the right, I cannot see him." That's disappointment. That's disappointment to the point of despair. Moses was on the backside of the desert for 40 years, and God called him and said, "I want you to go back to Egypt, where you came from, to the house of Pharaoh, where you were raised, and I want you to deliver the people of Israel with my power." Moses, after much protestations, went to Pharaoh, and he said, "Thus says the Lord, let my people go." And Pharaoh looks at him like, "You've got to be kidding." And he says, "No." And not only does he say no, he loads up the work on the slave labor of the people, makes their lives even harder, beats the foremen when they do not meet their quotas, and the people come back to Moses and they are angry. And then Moses goes to God, and this is what Moses' disappointment looked like. He said, "Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, why have you brought harm to this people, and why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done harm to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all.'" And that's disappointment to the point of feeling deceived. And then there's Jeremiah. He prophesied 40 years to a rebellious nation of Israel. They never listened, they never obeyed, and in the end, the judgment came to the nation of Babylon, and they came and they destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple, they slaughtered so many of the people, and Jeremiah is looking on. And the pain and the agony and the confusion are overcoming him, and he thinks everything in his life was a waste and everything was for naught. This is what disappointment looked like to him. He's talking to God about God. "He has besieged me and encompassed me with bitterness and hardship. In dark places he has made me dwell, like those who have been long dead. He has walled me in so that I cannot go out. He has made my chain heavy. When I cry out, I call for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stone. He has made my paths crooked. My soul has been rejected from peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength has perished, and so has my hope in the Lord." Now that's disappointment, I would say, to the point of despair. We have Mary of Bethany. You know Mary, Sister Martha, Brother Lazarus. And Lazarus gets sick, and he's very sick unto death. And Mary and Martha send word to Jesus. They say, come quickly. Lazarus is very sick. And Jesus not only doesn't come quickly, he doesn't come for 4 days. And at the time he gets there, Lazarus is literally dead and buried. And so Mary, when she hears that Jesus is nearby and coming to them, she goes to him, and here's her encounter with him. It's very short and very poignant. Therefore, when Mary came before where Jesus was, she saw him. She fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And that's disappointment to the point of feeling betrayed. The question this morning then is, what is at the root of our struggle with disappointment with God, when we are disappointed with God? When our lives are blown apart, our sense of desire, expectation, and hopes are shattered in some way, large, medium, and small. The root of it is in the struggle to understand why. And you see that in Job, Moses, Jeremiah, and Mary. They're trying to understand, trying to figure out what God is doing and why. Now, we are thinking, reasoning people. It is as instinctive as can be because that's the way God made us. He made us to think. He made us to reason. And so trying to understand is the most natural thing. And you know what? God is not displeased. So, that's the struggle. Now, the desire and the struggle to understand is not really the problem. The problem is our confidence, even our overconfidence, that we can understand, that we must understand. We will not be free of our disappointment with God until we do understand. Now that is where we get into dark places and get into deep water. I mean, if we can't, we come to the conclusion because we're thinking, reasoning people, that if I can't understand it, then it's wrong. It's illegitimate. If it doesn't make sense, then it's unjustifiable and it must change. And with that kind of confidence, overconfidence in our ability to understand, then disappointment with God grows exponentially. Okay, and that's where we get into trouble, and we've all gotten into that trouble. Now, usually we begin well. When some sort of disappointment comes to us, usually we start well. We get before God, we pour out our heart to Him, and you know, it's interesting because so many times, most of the time, when we're faced with some sort of situation where there's a great difficulty going on, what we find is God answering personally, sometimes miraculously. We see Him coming to our aid in a timely fashion. We forget how many times He does that. That is His normal mode of operation, if you will. But what we remember is the times when He doesn't answer in a timely way. And it can drive us into what you would call dark conclusions and dark places. And so let me just kind of share a little bit of what that darkness can look like in terms of disappointment with God. The first thing is we can come to what you call dark conclusions about God. First dark conclusion we can come to is God is punishing me. This is happening to me because I deserve it. I'm getting what I deserve. And what that does, that calls into question the grace of God, because what it says is there is some wrath left. When Christ died on the cross for me and absorbed the wrath of God, He didn't quite get it all. And the rest is coming to me, and it's coming to me now, and I deserve it. And that calls into question this magnificent, boundless, endless grace of God that's been poured out on us. And we mistake discipline for punishment, and we say that we are under His wrath and He's giving us what we deserve. That's a very, very dark place. The other one is that God is not good, or at least He's not good in a way that matters to me. He's good to other people, He's good in the Bible, He's good theologically, but His goodness really doesn't come to me. What that does, it calls into question not only God's goodness, but also His kind intentions toward us. And the third one is God is cruel. The way that usually comes out is I wouldn't treat my kids like this. What kind of God does this? What kind of God would do that to one that belongs to Him? And in that dark moment, the fatherhood of God then goes called into question. And God somehow in His fatherhood becomes less than our fatherhood or our parenting skills. And He becomes, if you will, subhuman in our minds because we would never do that. But God is doing that. Now those can take us to dark places. One is anxiety and fear, because when we come to dark conclusions about God, we come to the conclusion that I'm on my own. I may belong to Him and I may be going to heaven, but I'm on my own here. I got to figure this out for myself. And suddenly anxiety and fear become our companions. They live with us, they live in us, walk around with us, and they speak to us every day. Another dark place is depression and sadness because there's no hope. If God's not listening and God doesn't care and maybe He's cruel, then there's no hope for me. And life loses its taste and its color, and you find that your soul has an ache in it that will not go away. Another dark place is indifference. Sometimes this is the inhabited place of the strong. God, talk to the hand. I don't want to hear it anymore. Whatever. I don't want to know to say, I'm curing you. Because it doesn't make sense, and it's not working for me. Talk to him. Then there's drivenness and materialism. I've got to fill up the emptiness in me, and so I'm going to grab for all the world can give me. I'm going to drive myself. I'm going to get what I can get. I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry because I'm just empty. And finally, the darkest place, perhaps of all, is sinful pleasures, where I've got to find a way out of the pain. If God's cruel and He's not good and His grace isn't sufficient, then this pain is not going to go away from me. And I've got to find ways to at least, on a short-term basis, take the pain away. And as we know, sin can be pleasurable for a season. So a lot of times we end up with sinful pleasures. How do I embrace God? What is it that I do in the midst of this disappointment when I don't know what to say? I don't know what to do. I don't know how to feel. Well, let's go back to Moses and Job and Jeremiah and Mary and see what they did. Okay. Now, first of all, I want you to know that these four people represent three possible outcomes in disappointment with God. If you are looking at Moses and Mary, what you're looking at is miraculous deliverance. And sometimes when we are deeply wounded and disappointed with God, we end up with a miraculous deliverance. Here you have Moses. All of a sudden, he finds that God is exactly who He said He is, going to do exactly what He said He was going to do, and He just literally obliterates the nation of Egypt, sets His people free, and as a final touch, destroys their army. And so this is a miraculous deliverance. And so Moses' disappointment with God, at least in that setting, has been answered in the most dramatic way possible. Then you got Mary. She follows Jesus to the grave, and she finds that Jesus is going to resurrect her dead brother, and he's alive. That is an incredible thing. And her disappointment is just completely swallowed up in a miraculous resurrection. So that's one end. And sometimes that's what God does with us. He reaches in and He does the most amazing things with us. And we stand back and we can't even believe it happened. That's one result. The second one is Job. Job is what you would call a mixed results, or a partial restoration. By the end of the time with God, Job has been restored. His wealth has been restored. His health has been restored. His reputation has been restored, so much so that God tells his detractors, his three ugly friends, if Job prays for you, you get to live. If he doesn't, you die. Now that's what you call having your reputation restored. He lost 10 children, and God gives him 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. Same as he lost, he got the same thing back. What he didn't get back was the 10 he lost. He got 10 new ones. And the joy and the wonder of all that, there's great restoration in Job's life, but it wasn't a complete restoration. There was still the grief and the sorrow for those 10 children that he lost. A lot of times, that's the result of our disappointment in God. There's mixed results that we don't completely understand. The last result that you can get is Jeremiah. And as you know, Jeremiah was called the weeping prophet for a reason. Nothing ever changed. And last we see Jeremiah in scriptures, he's headed to Egypt with a rebellious remnant. They're making him go with them to the last place on earth a Jew should go, and the last place on earth a prophet of the nation of Israel would want to go, and that's back to Egypt. And that's where it ends. We don't know beyond that. So those are the 3 things that can happen, because we don't want to operate under some false illusions that, if I do everything right and say the right things and understand the right things, then everything's going to be fine. Maybe things will be fine, but they'll be good, and maybe they'll change it. With that in mind, let's go back to these people and see what they did. Now Moses, he kept returning to God's presence. He kept listening. He kept walking by faith in the midst of what you call the chaos of his life. And it was chaos, but that's what he kept doing. Mary, she fell at the feet of Jesus, and then she followed him to the grave. Job, let me just read you what Job did. Job 23, verses 10 and 17. He says, "But he knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. I am not silenced by the darkness or the deep gloom which covers me." Job clung to the truth, and he refused to be silent. If you read the book of Job, Job was never silent until the end. This is what Jeremiah did in the midst of his disappointment. Lamentations 3, 19 to 32, and then verses 39 to 41. He's talking, this is Jeremiah in the first person. It says, "Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and the bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the people who seek him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he should bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and be silent, since he has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust, perhaps there's hope. Let him give his cheek to the smiter, let him be filled with reproach. For the Lord will not reject forever, for if he causes grief, then he will have compassion, according to his abundant loving kindness." And then 39 to 41, "Why should any living mortal or any man offer complaint in view of his sins? Let us examine and probe our ways. Let us return to the Lord. Let us lift up our heart and hands toward God in heaven." Now Jeremiah, he stayed with God's presence. He remembered who God really was. He submitted to God. He waited on God. He repented of his sins, and he worshiped God. Jeremiah did a lot of things. You know, Eugene Peterson, in his book Run with the Horses, which is one of my all-time favorites, it's about the life of Jeremiah. It comes to the last page of the book. I read it again this week, and he says, you know, we look at the life of Jeremiah, and we're looking for closure. We're looking for Jeremiah to be successful. We're looking for Jeremiah to be rewarded. We're looking for, please God, put a bow on this story. He said, but we get no closure. We get nothing. He said, all we get is this towering life, magnificently lived in the presence of God. That's all we get. There will be no deliverance, no resurrection, no restoration. For some of you, God has something greater in mind. He does. Something that only He knows. Something that's more precious and more eternal than you've even thought of, okay? The road of Jeremiah is the most difficult. And I know that some of you are on the road of Jeremiah. But it's a precious place, and it's a dramatic and dynamic place. It's alive with the presence of God. One of the things that Job and Moses and Mary and especially Jeremiah understood, if we enter into our brokenness in the midst of our disappointment with God, we will see and experience things that we can never imagine. And the best part is we'll become someone that we never imagined.